The morning of September 13th, 1987 began like most mornings in the far north, gray, cold, and utterly without drama. Somewhere over the Barents Sea, roughly 270 kilometers southeast of Vardø, Norway, a four-engine turboprop droned steadily through air that smelled of salt and ice. The Royal Norwegian Air Force P-3B Orion, tail number 602, named the Gunnar Isaacson after a Norwegian Arctic explorer, had been airborne for hours. Her 10-man crew, led by Captain Jan Salvesen, were doing what they had been doing for years. Watching, listening, logging the movements of Soviet naval vessels threading through the dark water below. The Soviets knew she was there. They always did. And on this particular morning, someone in the chain of command of the Soviet Air Defense Forces decided that they had had enough. If you want to understand what happened next, and what it meant for a much larger, still unresolved confrontation playing out daily in the skies above the Arctic, you have to understand one simple, electrifying fact. The aircraft scrambled to intercept the Norwegian patrol plane that morning was not the usual workhorse of Soviet air defense. It was not a MiG-21, not a MiG-23. It was something the Western world had only recently glimpsed in blurry satellite photographs and intelligence reports marked with the highest classifications. It was the Sukhoi Su-27, the flanker, the aircraft that the Soviet Union had designed for one purpose, and one purpose only, to destroy the American F-15 Eagle. If you're watching this channel for the first time, make sure you hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Stories like this one are what we're all about, and you won't want to miss what comes next. To understand why two specific aircraft, the F-15 Eagle and the Su-27 flanker, found themselves locked in one of the most psychologically loaded confrontations of the entire Cold War, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the Cold War, but the beginning of an arms race within an arms race. The beginning of the most sophisticated, expensive, and exhausting competition in the history of aviation. In 1969, Soviet military intelligence learned something that alarmed the highest levels of the Kremlin. The United States Air Force had launched what it called the FX program, a project to design a dedicated air superiority fighter unlike anything that had flown before. What emerged from that program, after years of wind tunnel testing and engineering refinement, was the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. When American pilots first flew it in 1972, their reaction was almost uniformly one of disbelief. The aircraft was not just fast. It was not just maneuverable. It was a different category of machine. As one early test pilot described it, the F-15 flew with a kind of authority that previous fighters simply did not possess. It could climb to 50,000 feet in under 60 seconds. Its thrust-to-weight ratio, the critical measurement of a fighter's raw energy, exceeded 1-to-1 at basic combat weight, meaning the aircraft could accelerate while pointing straight up. Its APG-63 pulse Doppler radar could pick up and track targets at ranges that had previously been reserved for ground-based systems. The Soviet response to this was swift and serious. The General Staff issued a requirement for what they called a perspektivny frontovoy istrebitel, a prospective frontline fighter. The specifications were, by any measure, extraordinary. It had to match the F-15's range, exceed it in maneuverability, carry a heavier weapons load, and do all of this while remaining within the Soviet industrial system's capacity to actually build it. The Sukhoi Design Bureau was tasked with the job, and what they produced, after years of iteration and refinement, was the T-10 prototype, which would eventually mature into the production Su-27. It entered service with the Soviet Air Forces in 1985. By any honest assessment, it was a remarkable aircraft. Twin AL-31F turbofan engines gave it a thrust-to-weight ratio comparable to the Eagle's. Its wing-body blended fuselage, designed in large part by the Soviet Aerodynamics Institute TSAGI, gave it a grace in the air that surprised even the engineers who built it. It could carry up to 10 air-to-air missiles, including the long-range R-27 radar-guided missile, the AA-10 Alamo in NATO nomenclature, and the highly agile short-range R-73, the AA-11 Archer, which was in several respects more capable than anything the Americans were flying at the time. It had a top speed exceeding Mach 2. It had a combat radius of over 900 miles. And critically, it had something the F-15 lacked entirely: an infrared search and track system, a passive sensor that could detect the heat signature of an enemy aircraft at long range without emitting any radar signal that the enemy could detect. On paper, the flanker was the answer to the Eagle. Whether it truly was, whether the machine that Soviet engineers had labored over for more than a decade could actually defeat the aircraft it had been designed to kill, was a question that 1987's Cold War confrontation was about to begin to answer. Not in combat, not yet, but in the most dangerous way short of actual war. The American F-15 community had been stationed in Alaska since 1982. Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage was home to the 21st Tactical Fighter Wing, and its pilots flew one of the most psychologically demanding missions in the entire United States Air Force. Every time the Soviets dispatched bombers along the Alaskan coast, and by 1987 they were doing so 33 times a year, more than double the previous average, F-15s were scrambled to intercept them. The pilots flew north over the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands, climbing into an environment so hostile that survival after an ejection was, in the words of more than one pilot who flew those missions, far from guaranteed. In the winter, the ambient temperature at altitude could reach -60 degrees Celsius. The sea below was dark and unforgiving. Search and rescue in those latitudes was an optimistic concept at the best of times. What the American pilots had been intercepting for years were the lumbering Soviet bombers, Tu-95 Bears, massive turboprop-driven aircraft that had been in service since the 1950s and flew their patrol routes with a kind of methodical, almost contemptuous predictability. Lieutenant Colonel Tim Klein, known to his squadron as Sweet Lou, flew more than a dozen of these Bear intercepts during his posting to Iceland with the 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron between January 1987 and February of the following year. He recalled that the Bears were, in tactical terms, almost reassuringly straightforward. They flew in the mid-20s between 24,000 and 27,000 feet, at an economical cruising speed. Their enormous contra-rotating propellers created radar returns so large that an F-15's radar could often pick them up at over 80 nautical miles. The intercept itself was a ritual. Close to visual range, photograph the bomber, confirm its identity, escort it until it left the air defense identification zone, return to base. Tense, certainly, but structured, predictable. What the pilots of Elmendorf and Keflavik were not yet fully prepared for, in the mid-1980s, was the possibility that the Bears might not be alone. That somewhere in the airspace ahead of them, perhaps beyond radar range, perhaps off to one side, perhaps approaching from an unexpected vector, there might be something else entirely. Something designed not to carry bombs. Something designed to kill fighters. The Su-27 had entered service in 1985, but in its early years it was rarely seen outside of Soviet airspace. Western aviation analysts knew it existed. Intelligence services had obtained performance estimates. The fighter weapons school at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada was already working on classified tactics to defeat it. One of the most important of these was a technique that would eventually be declassified under the name of the F-pole maneuver. The concept was simple in principle and brutally difficult in execution. An F-15 pilot encountering an Su-27 at beyond visual range would enter the engagement high and fast, pointing directly at the threat, and launch his AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles at the maximum optimum range. Immediately after launch, he would crank into a hard turn, away from the threat, to the very edge of his radar's gimbal limit. The Sparrow, already in the air, would fly the shortest possible path to the target. The flanker's missiles, if launched at the same moment, would have to fly a longer, curving path to reach the Eagle. In theory, the American missiles would arrive first. In theory. But the F-pole maneuver was a classified technique. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged. And in the autumn of 1987, the question of how an American fighter pilot would actually react when a Soviet Su-27 appeared on his radar for the first time, not in a simulation, not in a briefing room, but in the gray reality of Arctic airspace, was still unanswered. September 13, 1987, answered part of it. But not in the way anyone expected. Lieutenant Senior Grade Vasily Tsimbel was a young pilot assigned to the 941st Interceptor Aviation Regiment, flying out of a base on the Kola Peninsula. On that morning, he was ordered to intercept a NATO maritime patrol aircraft that had been tracking Soviet naval vessels in the Barents Sea. The aircraft he was flying was the Su-27, tail number 36 Red, from the very first production batches of the type. It was armed with a full complement of missiles, R-27T and R-27ER variants of the long-range Alamo, and shorter-range weapons as well. For Symbol, according to later accounts, this was his first real intercept of an actual target. He was about to introduce the flanker to the world. The Norwegian P-3B Orion and its crew had been in the area for some time. Captain Salvesen knew the Soviets would scramble an interceptor. They always did. What none of the Orion's crew were expecting was the aircraft that appeared off their wing. The Su-27 was enormous compared to any fighter they had seen in those waters before. Its swept wings and long, tapered fuselage were immediately recognizable to any aviation professional as something categorically different. The aircraft closed to within a few meters of the P-3 on the first pass, its two massive engines filling the cabin with noise and its tail number clearly visible. The Norwegian photographer aboard seized the opportunity and began shooting. The images he took that day, close-up, startlingly clear photographs of a fully armed Soviet Su-27 carrying a complete air-to-air weapons load, were the clearest images of the flanker that Western intelligence services had yet obtained. Within weeks, they would appear in aerospace publications around the world, confirming what the analysts had suspected. The flanker was real, it was operational, and it was carrying weapons that could reach out and kill at distances that changed the fundamental calculus of any potential air war over Europe or the Arctic. But the photographs were not the most significant thing that happened that morning over the Barents Sea. Symbol made a second pass, then a third. On the third pass, in what subsequent analysis would attribute to either intentional aggression or a serious misjudgment of spacing at very low closing speeds, the Su-27's vertical stabilizer struck the number 1 propeller blade of the Norwegian Orion's right wing engine. The collision was audible inside the P-3. The prop blade shattered, sending fragments into the Orion's fuselage and causing immediate decompression. The Norwegian aircraft dropped 3,000 meters in under 60 seconds. The Su-27's vertical stabilizer tip was torn away. Both aircraft, by what must be considered remarkable fortune and the skill of their crews, managed to reach their respective bases. Symbol landed his damaged flanker at Kola. Salvesen brought his wounded Orion back to Bodo Air Base in Norway. All 10 crew members survived. The Soviet pilot, it was later reported, returned to his squadron to find a small silhouette of a P-3 painted onto the fuselage of his aircraft. A kill marking, though one that acknowledged the ambiguity of what had happened. In the years that followed, the Su-27 designated 36 Red would be renumbered, but the kill marking reportedly remained. For the Western aviation community, and specifically for the F-15 pilots whose daily operational reality now included the possibility of encountering the flanker, the photographs from that intercept were simultaneously fascinating and sobering. Here was an aircraft they had been briefed on in classified settings. An aircraft represented on threat boards by silhouettes and estimated performance numbers, now documented in sharp, undeniable detail. You could see the rivets on its fuselage. You could see the expression on its pilot's face. You could see the missiles hung under its wings, real weapons on a real aircraft in the hands of a real adversary. And what the photographs made clear, to anyone who studied them carefully, was that the Su-27 was not a paper threat. It was not a propaganda exercise. It was a mature, sophisticated, fully integrated weapons system. The aircraft's dimensions alone were striking. Roughly the same size as the F-15, with a wingspan of nearly 50 feet and a length exceeding 60 feet. The blended wing body design, visible in the photographs in a way no technical drawing had quite conveyed, explained how the aircraft achieved its remarkable aerodynamic performance. The missiles visible on the wing pylons, the R-27s with their long, slender bodies, were a direct answer to the AIM-7 Sparrow. The infrared search and track sensor, a small teardrop faring forward of the cockpit, was a capability the F-15 simply did not have. The year was 1987. 2 years earlier, the flanker had entered service. In the same year, the 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Keflavik had transitioned from F-4 Phantoms to F-15C Eagles. The collision of these two timelines, the Americans upgrading their Arctic interceptors precisely as the Soviets were deploying their most capable fighter to the same theater, was not a coincidence. It was the Cold War operating as designed. Each move answered by a counter-move, each escalation met with a corresponding escalation, with the actual pilots in the cockpits carrying the weight of decisions made in offices and conference rooms in Washington and Moscow. What the pilots themselves understood and what the bureaucracies on both sides preferred not to dwell on, was that in this particular arena, the gray, frozen airspace over the Barents Sea and the Bering Sea and the Jiayuke Gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, the margin between a close encounter and a catastrophe was measured in meters, sometimes less. The Orion's crew had learned that lesson on September 13th. They had survived it. Not every crew in the history of Cold War intercepts had been so fortunate, and not every encounter between American Eagles and Soviet flankers in the years that followed would be as clearly documented or as carefully analyzed. What was happening in those skies was something unprecedented in military history. Two of the most capable fighter aircraft ever built, representing two of the most powerful nations on Earth, were meeting each other regularly in operational conditions. Not in war, not in exercises, but in the real, consequential, potentially fatal arena of actual airspace. Each encounter was an intelligence operation. Each encounter was a test of nerve. And each encounter was, by the narrowest of margins, not the incident that started the war. To understand what the F-15 pilots were thinking when they now encountered not just bears but flankers, when the aircraft they had trained to kill in simulations appeared in their actual radar scope, you have to understand something about the culture of the American fighter pilot community in the late 1980s. These were men who had been selected from among the best aviators in the Air Force, then pushed through a training pipeline that was, by design, intended to produce a specific kind of confidence. Not recklessness, confidence. The belief, earned through thousands of hours of demanding realistic training, that they could handle whatever appeared in front of them. Paul Woodford, a former F-15 pilot who flew the Eagle at Soesterberg Air Base in the Netherlands from 1978 to 1982, and then at Elmendorf from 1982 to 1985, before returning to fly Eagles again in the late 1980s, articulated the professional assessment of the flanker threat with characteristic precision. The Su-27, he recalled, emerged as a serious concern for the F-15 community in the late 1980s as significant numbers of the aircraft began to be fielded. The published performance specifications of the F-15 and the Su-27 were, taken together, remarkably even. Similar thrust-to-weight ratios, similar maximum speeds, similar G-load envelopes. The flanker's radar, the N001 mech, could track bomber-sized targets at up to 86 miles, though against a target the size of an F-15, its effective range was closer to 62 miles. The F-15s and APG-63 was comparable in many respects. Where the Americans believed they had the advantage was not in hardware. It was in training. The pilots at Elmendorf and Keflavik and Kadena were flying, on average, 3 times a week. They were flying hard, aggressive training sorties against dedicated aggressor squadrons whose entire purpose was to simulate the exact tactics the Soviets would use. The fighter weapons school at Nellis was producing new tactics regularly, classifying them, disseminating them to the operational community, refining them based on feedback from actual intercepts. The Soviet pilots, American intelligence assessed, were flying and training far less. Their sortie rates were lower. Their fuel allocation was more constrained. Their training was more scripted. Whether this assessment was accurate, whether the pilots in the cockpits of the Soviet Su-27s that were now appearing alongside Tu-95 Bears in the airspace around Alaska were genuinely less prepared than their American counterparts, was a question that the Cold War's restraint prevented from being answered definitively. But it informed every decision made by American planners. It was the bet they were placing every time an F-15 launched from Elmendorf into the Arctic night to intercept a Soviet formation. And it was the bet that, on a number of occasions in the final years of the Cold War, was tested in ways that neither side's official accounts have ever fully described. Stories like this one exist because individual pilots, in moments of genuine danger, made decisions that kept the peace. If this kind of deep dive history is what you're here for, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you won't miss a single one. Hit the button now. By the time the autumn of 1987 gave way to the winter, word had traveled through the F-15 community with the particular speed that only genuinely significant intelligence achieves. The photographs taken by the Norwegian crew of the P-3B Orion sharp, close, undeniable were being studied at Elmendorf, at Keflavik, at Kadena in Okinawa, and at every other installation where Eagles sat on alert. The intelligence community circulated them with appropriate classification markings. The fighter weapons officers at Nellis reviewed them in the context of the tactics they had been refining. And the pilots who would actually be climbing into F-15s for the next round of intercepts over the Barents and the Bering and the North Atlantic studied them with the particular intensity of men who understood that the subject of the photographs might one day be pointing its nose toward them. What the photographs showed, what they confirmed, for those who had been following the flankers' development through classified channels, was that the geometry of the Cold War air threat had fundamentally changed. When the 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Keflavik had been flying F-4 Phantoms in the early 1980s, the mathematics of an intercept were relatively straightforward. The Bears flew at known altitudes and predictable speeds. Their radar emissions were well characterized. Their weapons were real, but their threat geometry was understood. An experienced Phantom crew knew, within a reasonable range of certainty, what would happen if they closed to visual range on a 295. The Bear's tail gunner might send a few rounds their way, which was a hazard taken seriously. The bomber itself was not going to turn and engage them. That was no longer the only scenario they needed to plan for. The Su-27's primary assigned mission, as understood by Western intelligence through the late 1980s, included precisely the role that the September intercept had previewed, escorting Soviet heavy bombers on their long-range patrol and strike missions. The flankers' combat radius, over 900 miles on internal fuel alone, made it uniquely suited to this task in a way that earlier Soviet fighters simply were not. A MiG-23 flogger could range out a certain distance from its coastal bases and then had to turn back. Its legs were not long enough for sustained escort work over the Arctic Ocean. The flanker had no such limitation. With its enormous internal fuel tanks, carrying nearly 20,000 pounds of fuel, it could fly from its bases on the Kola Peninsula into the Barents Sea, transit northward along the Norwegian coast, and extend its patrol well into areas previously covered only by the bombers themselves. And it could do all of this carrying a full combat load of air-to-air missiles designed to shoot down exactly the kind of aircraft that would be sent to intercept it. Paul Woodford, whose F-15 career had taken him from the Netherlands to Alaska and eventually to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, articulated the professional reckoning that the Eagle community arrived at in those years with characteristic precision. The flanker and the Eagle were, he acknowledged, evenly matched on paper. Similar thrust-to-weight ratios. Similar maximum speeds. Similar G-load envelopes. The publicly released figures on the F-15 and the Su-27 showed that in terms of raw aircraft performance, the two machines sat at roughly the same level. But there were specific areas where the flanker held genuine advantages, and the F-15 community did not pretend otherwise. The Su-27's infrared search and track system, that small teardrop fairing forward of the cockpit, was one of them. The ability to passively detect the heat signature of an enemy aircraft at up to 60 miles without emitting any radar signal was a capability the F-15 simply lacked. In a serious beyond visual range engagement, the Su-27 pilot could potentially know where the Eagle was before the Eagle knew where the Su-27 was. There was also the matter of the R-73 missile. The AA-11 Archer, as NATO designated it, was by any honest assessment a more capable short-range weapon than the AIM-9M Sidewinder that American F-15 pilots were carrying in the late 1980s. The R-73 could be slaved to a helmet-mounted sight, allowing a Soviet pilot to simply look at a target and command a missile launch, a capability that the American aircraft would not field in operational service until years later with the introduction of the AIM-9X. In a close-in turning fight within the merge, a Soviet pilot with the R-73 and a helmet sight enjoyed a geometric advantage that could not be dismissed. The Eagle community knew it. It was precisely this knowledge that reinforced the tactical doctrine the F-15 pilots trained to so relentlessly. Do not let the fight go to the merge. Win it at beyond visual range. Fire at optimum range, crank into the F-pole maneuver, and make the Alamo fly a longer, curving path than the Sparrow. Never give the flanker pilot a chance to use his helmet sight and his Archer. The doctrine was sound. The question that no one could answer with certainty, that the Cold War's essential restraint prevented from being answered, was whether it would work under the actual conditions of an operational intercept over the Arctic. Under the stress and noise and cold and disorientation of a real engagement, with missiles actually in the air and the radar warning receiver screaming and the ground far below. Theory and practice are different things. Every pilot who had been through the fighter weapons school knew that. The syllabus was designed to compress the gap between them, but it could never close it entirely. What the F-15 pilots at Elmendorf were experiencing in those final years of the Cold War was something stranger and more psychologically complex than simple threat assessment. They were experiencing, on a regular basis, the closest thing to a peer encounter that the post-Vietnam American fighter community had ever known. The Bears had always been manageable in a tactical sense. The flanker was different. When an Su-27 appeared on the radar scope of an F-15 over the Bering Sea, and by the late 1980s and into 1989 and 1990, this was happening with increasing regularity as Soviet long-range aviation missions began regularly incorporating flanker escorts. The psychological texture of the intercept changed entirely. Think about what that moment actually meant from inside the cockpit of an F-15. You are flying north-northwest over the Bering Sea, at perhaps 28,000 feet, in an environment where the temperature outside the canopy is minus 45 degrees Celsius and the water below is dark and covered with ice floes. Your radar scope is showing you the return of a Tu-95, its enormous contra-rotating propeller signatures unmistakable. Standard intercept. You have done this dozens of times. Your wingman is 2 miles off your right wing, and you are both in the cruise managing fuel, monitoring the AWACS chatter on the tactical frequency. And then your radar scope shows something else. A smaller return, faster moving, closer to you than the bear. Your radar warning receiver stays silent because the contact has its own radar turned off. The return is coming from a bearing and closure rate that makes no sense for a bomber. It makes sense for a fighter. The 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Keflavik, in their accounts of this period, used particular language to describe these moments. The word that recurs is professional, as in the conduct of the Soviet pilots when they appeared was professional. The flanker would slide into formation somewhere above or to the side of the bear, positioning itself with the geometry of a covering fighter, far enough back to react to threats, close enough to the bombers to protect them, maintaining the kind of disciplined spacing that spoke to genuine training and genuine tactical awareness. These were not the improvised, aggressive maneuvers of a nervous pilot. They were the calm movements of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why, which was precisely what made them unsettling. When a Soviet pilot in an Su-27 positioned his aircraft relative to an American F-15 approaching to photograph a bear, he was doing several things simultaneously. He was covering his bombers. He was communicating without a single word on the radio that the Soviet air defense forces had upgraded their capabilities and their intent. And he was, through the simple fact of his presence, conducting his own reconnaissance. The infrared search and track sensor on his aircraft was collecting data on the thermal signature of the Eagle, information that would go into Soviet tactical planning files, information that would inform the threat parameters used to develop countermeasures and missile guidance updates. The F-15 pilot was being studied. Every intercept was a mutual intelligence operation. The American pilots understood this. During these encounters, according to Paul Woodford's account, the covering aircraft in the F-15 element would maintain what he described with characteristic understatement as an IR missile trained on the targets. A flip of the master arm switch away from being fired. Just in case. The pilots did not discuss this protocol in detail with anyone outside the community. It was simply the way the mission was flown. You took the photographs. Your wingman covered you. And if something changed, if a hand moved toward a weapons panel, if an aircraft broke suddenly toward you, if the geometry of the encounter became something other than the ritual it was supposed to be, you were, in theory, ready. The emphasis must be placed on the words "in theory," because what no amount of training could fully prepare a pilot for was the psychological experience of looking across 30 feet of Arctic air at the pilot of an Su-27 flanker who was looking back at him. The accounts from pilots who participated in these late Cold War intercepts share this quality almost universally. The shock of recognition. Not the recognition of an enemy exactly. Something more complicated than that. The recognition of a mirror. You were looking at a man who had gone through a selection process as demanding as your own. Who had trained as hard as you had, albeit in a different system and with different constraints. Who was flying an aircraft that had been designed, from its first blueprint, to kill yours. Who was carrying, under his wings, missiles whose sole purpose was to destroy the machine you were sitting in. And who was, at this precise moment, doing his job with the same calm professionalism that you were trying to project from your own cockpit. One of the more remarkable documented instances of this late Cold War psychological encounter occurred not over the frozen north but over the Baltic Sea, where USAF F-15 Sea Eagles of the 493rd Fighter Squadron, the Grim Reapers, based at RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom, conducted regular NATO air policing rotations that brought them into contact with Soviet and later Russian Su-27 flankers. In footage that became public decades after it was filmed, a Russian Air Force Su-27P from the 72nd Guards Aviation Base can be seen executing a hard bank directly into the nose of an F-15C at extremely close range, a maneuver the Russians called a demonstration of authority, and the Americans called unsafe and unprofessional. The footage shows the flanker sliding from a parallel formation track into a hard left turn, its nose coming around to point directly at the Eagle. The American pilot, unable to simply hold course without risking a collision, is forced to react, to give way, to acknowledge the Soviet aircraft's presence in the most visceral possible manner. It was not the only time this happened. Russian Su-27 pilots in the Baltic theater developed, over the course of the late Cold War period and continuing into the 1990s and beyond, a repertoire of provocative but carefully calibrated maneuvers whose purpose was to establish dominance over the airspace without actually firing a weapon. Barrel rolls over the top of American reconnaissance aircraft. High-speed passes within 20 feet of patrol planes. Hard turns that inserted the flanker's enormous fuselage directly between an American aircraft and its photographic target. Each of these maneuvers carried real risk. At the speeds and altitudes involved, a miscalculation of a few meters, a slight variation in bank angle, a small difference in closure rate, was the difference between a close encounter and a catastrophe. And yet they continued year after year, conducted with the precision that spoke to deliberate training. The Soviet and Russian pilots were not acting randomly. They were executing a doctrine. The Pugachev Cobra, which became famous when test pilot Viktor Pugachev performed it at the Paris Air Show in June of 1989, was the public demonstration of a principle the Soviet pilots had been living with for years. The Su-27 could do things that no other production fighter in the world could do. Pugachev climbed his sky-blue flanker to altitude above the Paris crowd and then, in the span of a heartbeat, pitched the nose up past vertical, past 90 degrees, past 120 degrees, and held it there, the aircraft's fuselage essentially parallel to the ground while the machine itself was still moving forward on its momentum, decelerating from cruise speed to nearly nothing in less than 2 seconds before the nose fell back through and the aircraft resumed normal flight. It was, by any standard, a maneuver that should have destroyed the aircraft. Every aerodynamic principle that conventional fighters operated under said it was impossible. The Cobra said otherwise. The Western aviation community watched it on television and in grainy recordings and tried to determine what tactical significance it carried. The honest assessment was nuanced. In a beyond visual range engagement, the Cobra was irrelevant. No missile exchange at long range was going to be settled by whether a pilot could momentarily point his nose backward. But in a close-in turning fight within the merge, the same aerodynamic qualities that allowed the Cobra also meant something very specific. The flanker could sustain high angles of attack that other aircraft could not. It could point its nose at targets that were no longer in front of it. Combined with the R-73 missile and its helmet-mounted sight, this capability transformed the geometry of a dogfight in ways that American tacticians spent considerable effort accounting for. The solution the F-15 community arrived at was the one it had always relied on. Do not let the fight reach that point. The F-pole maneuver was the doctrine. Beyond visual range engagement was the imperative. Fly fast, fly high, fire at maximum range, crank away, and make the flanker's missiles work harder than yours. As Paul Woodford put it, reflecting on the tactical calculus of those years, if I did merge with a flanker, he would fly good basic fighter maneuvers. Their pilots were better trained, and that should give them the advantage in a dogfight. But if there is one thing learned about dogfighting, it is that it is a great equalizer, and only one of you comes out alive. That last sentence deserves to be held for a moment. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is precise. In the late 1980s, flying above the cold water of the Bering Sea or the Grey Baltic, the pilots of the 21st Tactical Fighter Wing at Elmendorf and the 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Keflavik were doing something that no doctrine, no exercise, no classified briefing could fully prepare them for. They were flying within visual range of aircraft whose specific purpose was to destroy them. They were managing, in real time, the most dangerous military standoff in the world. And they were doing it with a professionalism that prevented, day after day and month after month and year after year, the encounter from becoming a war. It is worth being specific about the numbers. Between 1985, when the Su-27 entered service, and December of 1991, when the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, The aircraft that had been designed in direct response to the F-15 flew alongside Soviet bombers on dozens of documented long-range patrol missions that brought it into operational proximity with American Eagles. The 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Keflavik, which had transitioned from F-4 Phantoms to F-15CS in January of 1985, flew more Cold War intercepts than any other unit in American aviation history. More than 3,000 intercepts total over the full Cold War period, the majority of them over the North Atlantic and Barents Sea approaches. The 21st Tactical Fighter Wing at Elmendorf, covering the Alaskan and Pacific approaches, added hundreds more. None of these encounters resulted in a weapons release. None of them became the incident that ignited the war that both sides had spent 40 years preparing to fight. But they came close enough on enough occasions to leave their mark on everyone who participated in them. There is a particular quality to the memory of those encounters that the pilots who participated in them describe in strikingly similar terms. Not fear exactly. They are trained past simple fear. Something more like sustained, calibrated alertness, the awareness that the man across from you has the means and, under different orders, the authority to end your life, and that the difference between the world you are flying in and the world where those orders are given is thinner than it appears from the ground. As one former F-15 pilot described the experience of closing to visual range on an Su-27 during a Bear escort mission in the Bering Sea Theater. You see the aircraft, and you know everything about it from the briefings and the technical manuals and the classified threat assessments. And then you see the aircraft and you realize the briefings and the manuals did not quite capture it. It is very large. It is very clean. And the pilot can see you looking at him. The 1991 Paris Air Show marked, in retrospect, both the zenith and the beginning of the end of the flanker's role as the anonymous adversary. The Cobra maneuver had already made Pugachev and his aircraft famous in aviation circles. Now, with the Soviet Union entering its terminal year, the politics of glasnost and perestroika had opened enough windows that the aircraft was presented to the Western public not as a classified threat but as a remarkable piece of engineering. Spectators at Le Bourget watched the flanker perform with a freedom that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier. Aviation journalists photographed it from the ground. Western pilots, some of whom had spent years training to shoot it down, looked at it up close for the first time outside of an intelligence briefing. The gap between the silhouette on the threat board and the physical reality of the machine was, in the words of more than one witness, considerable. The Soviet Union dissolved on Christmas Day of 1991. The red-starred aircraft that had escorted bears along the Alaskan coast and turned hard into American F-15s over the Baltic now belonged to Russia, or to Ukraine, or to Kazakhstan, or to the other successor states whose armed forces inherited pieces of the Soviet military apparatus. The bases and the regiments that had faced the Americans across the Arctic and the North Atlantic were suddenly operating in an entirely different political context. The hostility that had structured every encounter, that had made every intercept a potential catastrophe, was formally declared to be over. And the remarkable thing that happened next, perhaps the most psychologically revealing thing in the entire story of the F-15 and the Su-27, was what the two air forces chose to do when the Cold War ended. American and Russian fighter pilots, many of whom had spent years flying within visual range of each other across some of the most dangerous airspace in the world, met for the first time without weapons armed. American pilots who had been trained to exploit the flanker's weaknesses now got to walk around one and ask its pilot how it actually flew. Russian pilots who had practiced Cobra maneuvers designed to shock Western aviators got to ask Eagle drivers whether it had worked. The mutual recognition that had always been present beneath the surface of those Cold War encounters, the acknowledgement never spoken but always understood, that you were facing a real adversary flying a real machine flown by a real pilot, could finally be expressed directly. The legacy of what those years of non-combat combat had produced was more durable than the Cold War itself. The tactics developed by the F-15 community to counter the flanker did not disappear when the Soviet Union did. The F-pole maneuver, refined through years of classified exercises and intelligence gathered from actual intercepts, remained in the syllabus. The understanding of the flanker's strengths, its IRST system, its helmet-mounted sight, the terrifying short-range agility that the Cobra had dramatized, shaped the requirements for the aircraft that would replace the Eagle. The F-22 Raptor, whose design work was already underway in the final years of the Cold War, reflected in almost every specification the lessons that the F-15 community had drawn from those years of flying alongside Su-27s over the frozen sea. Stealth, A new beyond visual range missile, the AIM-120 AMRAAM, that could guide itself to the target without requiring the launching pilot to maintain radar lock throughout the flight. Supercruise capability, the ability to sustain supersonic speed without afterburner, that would allow it to dictate the terms of the engagement in ways the Eagle could not. The Su-27, for its part, did not become irrelevant. The basic design that Sukhoi had evolved through the painful 1970s and the difficult early 1980s proved, in the years after the Cold War, to be one of the most adaptable fighter platforms ever built. The Su-30, the Su-34, the Su-35, all of them were developments of the original flanker airframe, carrying with them the fundamental aerodynamic principles that had made the original aircraft so formidable. In May of 2017, when NORAD scrambled F-15s off the Alaskan coast to intercept a formation of Russian Tu-95 Bears, the bombers were escorted by a pair of Su-35S flankers, direct descendants of the aircraft that had first appeared off Norway 30 years earlier, carrying the same family of missiles, operated by pilots trained in the same tradition. The wheel had turned, and the encounter looked very much like the ones that had taken place in 1987 and 1988 and 1989, with newer aircraft wearing the same roles. This is what those years of Cold War intercepts had established, more clearly than any briefing or exercise or war game ever could. The F-15 and the flanker were peers. Not identical, their designers had made different choices, reflected different priorities, solved the same fundamental problem in ways that produced aircraft with distinct characters. But peers in the sense that mattered most. Neither could assume, on the basis of hardware alone, that it would prevail against the other. Neither could dismiss the threat. The Cold War had been, among many other things, a 40-year argument between two philosophies of how to build a fighter aircraft. The F-15 said, "Radar first, missiles first, win at long range before the enemy knows you are there." The Su-27 said, "Aerodynamics first, agility first, survive the worst the enemy can do and then finish it in close." Both philosophies had merit. Neither was wrong. That the argument was never settled in actual combat was, given what the cost of settling it would have been, the best possible outcome. The pilots on both sides understood this in ways that their governments did not always acknowledge. The professional respect that grew across those years of close encounters, the respect of men who had studied each other's machines and tactics and trained against simulated versions of each other for their entire careers, was real, and it survived the Cold War in a way that most political structures did not. There was a final, quiet irony in the story of these two aircraft. When the Soviet Union fell, the United States military acquired, through various post-Cold War arrangements with successor states, actual Su-27s for evaluation. American test pilots at classified facilities flew the aircraft that their F-15 predecessors had spent years preparing to fight. The assessment, when it was eventually declassified, was balanced and honest in the way that serious professional evaluations tend to be. The flanker was formidable. Its aerodynamic performance was everything the intelligence community had estimated. Its systems had real strengths and real weaknesses. It was, in the judgment of pilots who had flown both machines, a genuinely worthy adversary. Exactly what the men in the cockpits over the Barents Sea and the Bering Sea had known, in their bones all along. The Cold War is over. The Bears are still flying. The flankers still escort them. And somewhere over the Arctic, on a gray morning that looks very much like the morning of September 13, 1987, a pilot in an F-15 or an F-22 or an F-35 is closing to visual range on an aircraft that was designed to kill his, flown by a man who was trained to do exactly that, and both of them are doing the thing that keeps the world intact. Their jobs, professionally, without pulling the trigger. The history of those who came before them, who flew the same ritual in older aircraft, over the same cold water, with the same knowledge of what the master arm switch would mean if things went wrong, is the history of how wars are prevented. Not by the absence of capable adversaries, not by the absence of lethal weapons, but by the sustained, daily, unglamorous professionalism of the people inside the cockpits, who understood what was at stake and chose, every time, to bring their aircraft home. If you've made it to the end of this story, you already know what kind of history this channel is built for. Subscribe now and share this video with someone who loves the real thing, not the myth of it.